And obviously we have a special guest today. Twinkle, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience? Hello? Okay. So it seems like she's not a big fan of Tailwind. So we're going to say bye to her. Bye, Twinkle. So in this video, we're going to talk about what's coming up in Tailwind version 4, how you would go about setting it up in a NextJs application, and more excitingly, the cool new CSS properties that you can use in version 4, things like container queries or the @property rule to define custom properties. We're going to use Tailwind Play to play around in the playground with these new properties. But before we get there, I just want to review this blog post that we have or the team had put together about the new Tailwind version 4. So the biggest change in Tailwind CSS version 4 and onward is going to be this new engine called Oxide, which is a Rust-based compiler for your Tailwind CSS, which you can read more about here. It changes the way that we set up Tailwind inside of our app or customize and configure it. But it is also a new paradigm of Tailwind being more CSS than JavaScript. And the features and benefits of using this new engine is here. But now Tailwind CSS is not like a plugin anymore, so you don't set it up using JavaScript. If you have already set up Tailwind CSS in your project, you have a tailwind.config.js, so you set it up or you configure it via a JavaScript file. So it's like a JavaScript plugin that plugs into your compiler. Now, this is no longer the case. They're using Lightning CSS directly, so it brings in more CSS native features into your CSS toolchain. You can use modern features like the add import. This is actually how we're going to implement Tailwind in or bring Tailwind into our CSS. We'll see this in action. You no longer would need auto prefixers, and you have access to modern CSS features like this new way of defining colors like RGB and hex. This is OK Leech, so it's a new way of creating this new or bringing this new modern features into your application. And also features like the layer @property, which is @property rules or the way to create custom properties. This is game changer if you have ever struggled with transitioning background gradients, because you can't unless you're using a JavaScript library. For example, I've done animations and transitions on background gradients using Framer Motion, but now because Tailwind is going to use these @properties to define custom properties in CSS, we can read these values and actually transition or animate them even inside of gradients. We're going to implement this inside the Tailwind playground together to see it in action. Color mix. This is a new way of defining colors using this color mix property or function that allows you to use opacity modifiers even easier on CSS variables. So if you have defined CSS variables in the past, if you wanted to enable to be able to use the opacity modifier in Tailwind, for example, if you have BG red 400 and then /50, which is giving you that background red but at 50% opacity, if you wanted to define or do the same thing with your own custom CSS variables, you had to define custom CSS variables either in HLS or HSL or RGB, and then read those values inside of your Tailwind config in a specific format to be able to add those opacity modifiers. But using this color mix, it just makes it so much easier to use these opacity modifiers on your custom CSS variables, even on the current color directive, which you can use it's often used in SVG components, but they're actually using this for border colors. So we're going to see what's different in a second as well. And then we have container queries. This is also another cool feature. We're going to see this in action as well together, which is using container queries and with this @, min, and max signs. Pretty cool. Now, Another thing that has changed is how you can compose different variants. So you must be familiar with different variants such as group, peer, has, not, and all that. Now you can compose all of them together to come up with something like this. So in the past, if you wanted to apply a property, if the group has focus, you would have gone group has, this was one utility, and then arbitrarily you would have selected a focus on the current element. But now you can just compose all of them together and say, if the group has focus, do this. Now, this doesn't stop here. You can compose anything. There is no limits to it. So you can literally go group, not, has, peer, not, and the rest. If for whatever reason you need to, you can do that. That's also interesting. Now, zero config content detection. If you have set up Tailwind in the past in your projects inside of your config, there's this content property where you would tell Tailwind where exactly to look for. So contents inside of your components, the pages directory or the app directory. Now with this new engine, you no longer need to define that content. It just picks it up on its own. As I mentioned, there's no need to use the plugins such as the auto prefixer. And the way that you would bring in Tailwind CSS inside of your main CSS or global CSS is with this add import, which is a rule inside of CSS. So the shift is more so Tailwind becomes a CSS first or native tool rather than a JavaScript plugin. And everything in Tailwind now is defined using this custom variables. So once you bring in this import, it is going to define all of the variables that you can use, from colors to margins to paddings. Everything that's available in Tailwind is now defined as a theme. You can override them. You can bring in your own custom variables and whatnot, which is pretty easy. And we're going to do this inside of our app as well. You can also reset everything with the syntax so that you can just easily write your own variables, which then Tailwind is going to generate custom utility classes based on these variables. So that's pretty cool. Now, another way to override or bring your own variables instead of using this to override, you can just, instead of bringing the whole Tailwind CSS, you can just bring in the preflight and the utilities and then define your own color. So you don't need to revert back the colors to whatever initial it was. So you just bring in this too. Now, another cool thing with defining your custom variables like so inside of your CSS using Tailwind is that now you can use them without the theme function. So you can just directly access them like so inside of your CSS. But you can also use them in things or libraries like Framer Motion. So Framer Motion has the ability to read custom CSS variables. So you don't need to use this resolve config function anymore. You can just directly access this variable inside of this motion div, which is a specific syntax from Framer Motion to apply animations if you have worked with it before. So here we're changing the Y property, which is translate Y, for this specific amount. And that is just basically reading var and then that specific CSS variable. Now, in terms of what has changed is some deprecated utilities have been removed, and the CSS or post CSS plugin and the CLI are separate packages. Now you can install whichever you want. The default border color was gray 200. It now defaults to current color, which makes more sense. This was a problem because if you were using a different shade of gray in your app, then your default border would have been different. So for example, I use zinc or slate, specifically these two that are mentioned here, more so in my apps, and then border would just default to gray. Now it's just to current color. And similar thing for the rings. Now instead of the 3 pixel blue ring, it's going to be 1 pixel and it's going to default to current color. Ring is a cool property instead of using borders, so you can use rings. I think this is using box shadows to create that same effect of a border and then outline for when you want to apply any focus. The rest is the roadmap to version 4 and some notes on how you can implement Tailwind CSS in your projects, which we're going to get into soon. But before we do that, I want to play around with a couple of new utilities in Tailwind version 4 inside of this Tailwind Play or Playground for Tailwind, which is a great place for implementing Tailwind in any component or playing around with new versions. So there is a drop down here where you can select the version you wanted to work with and then just write your Tailwind CSS and see it in action here. So you can select the version 4, the alpha here. Now the first thing we're going to talk about is the container queries. Now let me explain from a high level what we have here. So let me just get rid of this and save. So here I have a section which has that yellow background, and then I have a container inside, which we're going to use the container primitive or directive on it. But inside of it, inside of this container, I have another container that has a grid layout. So it has grid columns tree, a gap, and then I'm using some container queries or some directives here. Now, let me just remove this @ signs from the beginning of these two to explain what this is doing in the first place, and then we're going to see it with the container. Now, if you have used Tailwind before, you should be familiar with these modifiers that we have, such as SM and MD, which targets a specific screen size in Tailwind. So if we can go to the docs to see this, in Tailwind CSS in the documentation, let's search for responsive. Now you can see this different breakpoints for SM or a small, it's 640 pixels, MD 768, and so on. So using these modifiers, like if I were to say just MD, it's going to give you a min width media query, meaning that we're targeting viewports from medium size and up, and without this max in front of it. Here we are targeting small screen sizes and up and bigger. Now you can also use it with the max, which is going to turn it into a max width to say we're going to cover everything up to medium size or everything up to this small size. So what are we doing here? So we have 3 columns. Up to medium size, I'm going to have 2 columns, and up to small, I'm going to have 1. Okay, so if I now shrink this the way that I have it now, I'm not using container queries. So this is responsive in relation to the viewport, which is this white background that you can see here. So when I shrink this, it is going to go to 2 columns and then to 1 column. But let's see where container queries would be useful. So imagine that I have 2 of these sections. So let's slap a width MD on this. Now, this is too small for me to have 3 columns now. But the way these modifiers work is that they are media queries. They're in relationship with your viewport. But now, this container or this div or this section is not the full width of my viewport. If it was, I didn't need container queries. But now, because it is a smaller than my viewport, I need to change the grid layout in relation to the size of my container and not the screen. Therefore, here I'm going to use an @container directive or utility here to mark this as the container. And now anytime inside of my code, when I'm using this @ sign, is going to be in relationship to that container. Okay, so now because my container is small, it turned into a grid columns of 1. If I now change this into large, maybe it's going to change into 2. And maybe if I go back to XL, it's going to give me 3 again. So this is pretty handy if you are changing grid layouts or maybe changing the font size depending on the container. That's not necessarily the full width of your screen or your viewport. So this was the first thing I wanted to show. Now next, let's look into animating background gradients using the new CSS @property rule that Tailwind uses to define our custom properties. So if we have a section, let's also create a div with a size of 60. Now to contrast this, let's drop this back down to version 3. And now I'm going to define some background gradients. So let's say background gradient to right. Let's go from sky of 500 to purple of 500. So we have our background gradient. Now let's say on hover, I want to change from maybe orange. So I'm going to go from orange 500, and then again on hover, I want to change the to property to be green to 400, whatever. So when I do the hover, it changes the from and to, but I don't have any animation. So let's add some animation. I'm going to add some transition all, but this is not going to change anything. Let's also add some duration for it to be nice and easy. But again, I don't have anything. And the reason why is the way that Tailwind used to define these properties are different in version 3 versus version 4. So let's change to version 4. Now, if I hover over one of these values, you can see it's using this new at property rules inside of CSS to create this custom properties like Tailwind gradient from, Tailwind gradient to, and Tailwind gradient via or stops, which then enables us to actually transition all of this. So if I now go ahead and use an arbitrary value to transition this Tailwind variable, so Tailwind gradient from and dash dash Tailwind gradient to, and also dash dash Tailwind gradient stop, and now save. If I come here now, you see this nice transition. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, it wasn't possible to do this in Tailwind or CSS really very easily without the use of the add property rules in CSS. I used to do this using framer motion to read the CSS property values or animate the change between the two once a state has changed in the React application, whether it's a hover or a click of a button or a slider inside of an image. But now you can natively do this thanks to this new way of defining CSS variables or custom properties inside of our Tailwind using this at property rule inside of CSS. Now, these couple of utilities was what I was most excited about, but I'm sure this new way of defining custom properties or the way Tailwind is working by using these native CSS directives is going to open the door to much more use cases. But next, let's actually look into implementing this new version 4 inside of a NextJs application. So I have cloned down our NextJs template, which is just NextJs TypeScript and Tailwind CSS inside of a project, as you can see here. So let's go back to the blog posts. Scrolling down, it is going to have this section where it explains how you can go ahead and try this alpha version using Vite or inside Next.js. So first, what we need to do is to install the latest version of Tailwind and also post CSS. So I'm going to copy these two, stop the dev server here. So let me close this off for a second. And I'm going to go pm I or add, and I'm going to go Tailwind next and Tailwind post CSS next. So let's clear this out. Let's go inside of our application, and we need to change a couple of things. So there is a post CSS config in your application. Find that and replace that with this new Tailwind post CSS. That's the first thing. Now, the second thing you would want to do is to just get rid of your Tailwind config altogether. We no longer need this. If you remember from the notes, I said there is no need for you to specify the content. It just picks up your files automatically, but you don't even need this file itself. So we can delete that. And then going to our global CSS, instead of bringing this at Tailwind directives, all we need to do is use an at import CSS rule to bring in Tailwind. Okay, so with this, let's go pm and dev. This should open up our application on localhost 3000. And let's see if our Tailwind is actually working. Let's go to our page. Now, as you can see, I have the text 3XL and font bold applying here. And if I go ahead and apply a different color, like text green and 500, this is going to change the text. So our Tailwind is working. Now, one thing you might notice is that this container class is not working because we used to define this inside of our Tailwind config, which we get rid of completely. And also, this doesn't work with chat.cn, with the way that chat.cn is using custom CSS variables and properties to set up or work on top of Tailwind. It's not working yet. So as I mentioned, it's not stable, but this is the new direction Tailwind is going on with less config, JS config, and more Tailwind native rules. But there's still things to figure out in terms of libraries and frameworks that work on top of Tailwind CSS. And that's a wrap for this video, folks. We covered what's coming up in Tailwind version 4. If there's any utilities or classes that I missed that you know of, let me know down in the comments. If you have any questions, like always, hit me up in the comments, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.